So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Wiener Holocaust Library's online events programme. I'm really delighted to see so many of you here tonight. This is one of the best attended online events that we've had, so that's really fantastic. I'm Barbara Warnock, the Senior Curator at the Wiener Holocaust Library. And I'm delighted to be hosting this talk tonight by Professor Wolf Gruner about individual Jewish resistance to the Nazis in Germany. This event is the final event in our event series for our Jewish resistance to the Holocaust exhibition, which officially was supposed to close tomorrow. Sadly, it hasn't reopened after the holidays because of the COVID-19 situation in the UK, but we hope to have an online version of the exhibition at some point soon, and you can still obtain the catalogue as well. But we're really honoured to have Professor Gruner here to kind of officially, in some senses, close the exhibition with his talk. So just a couple of technicalities before I introduce Professor Gruner. So the event is being recorded, but only the speakers can be seen. Everyone is muted. There'll be a chance for questions from the audience at the end, but if you could just put any questions that you have in the chat function at the end of the talk, and I will field some of those to Professor Gruner. There is an option to have closed captions, and you can find that on the bottom of your screen if you would like captions, live captions as the event progresses. Also, just to say that you might wish to switch between different views. So in the top right of your screen, there's a speaker view icon, and you can switch between viewing a PowerPoint, viewing the speaker, and so on, depending on what you prefer. So just to let you know about that. So as I said, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Gruner here tonight to expand upon a theme that's touched upon in the exhibition, but is not at all the main focus, and that is individual Jewish resistance in Nazi Germany. So Wolf Gruner holds the Shapiro-Gorin Chair in Jewish Studies and is Professor of History at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He's also the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. He is the author of 10 books on the Holocaust, among them Jewish Forced Labor Under the Nazis, Economic Needs and Nazi Racial Aims. He has also written a prize-winning book, The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, and a recent co-edited volume about Kristallnacht, the November pogrom. He is currently finishing the manuscript of his book about individual defiance, protest and resistance of German and Austrian Jews during the Holocaust. So I will now hand you over to Professor Gruner. Wolf.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research, and especially in the setting of kind of the framework of this exhibition, which I found very important. And there's good news that I've actually finished this manuscript. So that's done, and I'm now looking for an agent, since this is a book for a broader audience. So it's trying to convey this topic of individual resistance to more people than just academics. So let me begin with two stories from Nazi Germany during the war. When Hans Oppenheimer left his 4-story apartment home, it was pitch black outside. Because of the Allied air raids, not a single light illuminated the street in front of the house, and not the whole city. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, and then he slowly moved away from his home. He knew that he was not supposed to be outside because there was a curfew for Jews at night. He was shivering, it was cold, and he also was scared. He was only 17 years old, but he had already the experience of 1 year work as a forced laborer in a labor camp. he anxiously waited for the Allied bombers to arrive. When the sirens started to blare, he rushed to the next fire alarm post and pulled the handle. The alarm bell rang. This was his plan that he had decided on some weeks ago, diverting the fire trucks from the actual bombing sites. Hans Oppenheimer was arrested on December 10, 1940, by the Gestapo. A court sentenced him to 3 years in prison for setting off more than a dozen wrong fire alarms. After almost 2 years in jail, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he perished. But there was also more open protest during the war. For example, in the capital of the Third Reich, in Berlin, in 1941, Hertha Reis, she was at the time 36 years old and a forced laborer. She had earlier been ordered to move out of her apartment to a small sublet room together with her mother and her son. Now a judge evicted the family from this small, tiny last resort of privacy. Having nowhere to go, she exclaimed in broad daylight in front of the Berlin courthouse, quote, "We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we finally lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people, just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against," end of quote. Amazingly, after 8 years of Nazi rule, these two Jews still had the courage to resist. Their stories challenged the still widespread belief that there was mainly a passive suffering of German Jews under the Nazi persecution. During the last decade, my systematic research revealed that hundreds of Jews did resist the persecution in Nazi Germany, immediately in 1933, but still, as I just told here, also during the war. And this rediscovery of these forgotten acts demands from us a reassessment of Jewish reactions towards Nazi persecution. In my presentation, I will first briefly describe the state of the research and point to reasons why scholars have kind of overlooked this kind of individual resistance. And then I will give a rough overview how German Jews did defy Nazi persecution. So let's discuss the development of research. Until now, most of the public and also some scholars subscribed to the idea that Jews in general, but particularly German Jews, did not resist the terrors of the Third Reich. The traditional perception of their passivity had been nourished by the fact that historians have discussed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust mostly in terms of organized or armed resistance, and thus neglected individual acts of opposition. Moreover, in the beginning of the 1960s, Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, and Raoul Hilberg all criticized an alleged lack of resistance. Although this was immediately questioned and challenged by Israeli scholars, and they brought up moral and spiritual resistance and which played still a role in discussions today. Nevertheless, academics settled on that resistance is mostly organized and armed, and it also mostly existed in Eastern Europe. Hence, a thorough evaluation of individual Jewish resistance is missing in almost all prominent Holocaust narratives. Even those who focus on the integration of Jewish voices, like in the widely acclaimed works of Saul Friedlander. And I think there are two main reasons who might explain this unexpected void. One is a limited conceptual approach and a limited source base. The other one is the limited source base for previous research. To elaborate a little bit more on the conceptual framework, in my research, I revive existing methodological approaches. So that's not what I do is nothing original. It existed before. Already in the 1950s, the Israeli scholar Meir Dvoretsky, and then in the 1970s, Konrad Krieg, the Australian historian, and the East German survivor Helmut Eschwege, all tried to open up the definition of Jewish resistance toward individual activities. Similar views were raised in the debate on general resistance in Nazi Germany in the 1980s in Germany. And the young German, young German historian Detlef Peukert tried to open up the scale of resistance to nonconformity, defiance, and protest. Based on such ideas, I use a very commonly known definition by Yehuda Bauer. And now let me share my screen. And just added one word, as you can see here, and does define Jewish resistance as any individual or group action in opposition to known laws, actions, and intentions. And this provided the framework for my research and does qualify disobeying laws or protest, oral protest, as resistance. And I think this is especially justified because in difference to other groups of the German population, Jews were exposed to specific racial persecution and also particular anti-Jewish laws. When one applies this new definition to the analysis of the Nazi society, it does produce astonishing results of individual Jewish opposition. So just to reevaluate existing photographs, which we always used, like this one, which you can find in a lot of kind of prominent Holocaust books, just to look closer at this picture, you see this is not just illustrating random terror of stormtroopers in 1933 in Munich. It is actually targeting Michael Siegel, a Jewish lawyer who was trying to intervene against the arrest of a Jewish client. Or take this picture of Dora Franken, which I usually use in my class at USC in Los Angeles to illustrate local restrictions against Jews. Here, the restriction for Jews to use the public pool. But if you look at this picture, why is Dora Franken posing in front of the entrance and the sign forbidden for Jews in this way? Look at her body language. This is not a document of humiliation, it is a document of opposition. Or take this picture from Lizzie Rosenfeld, who is sitting on a bench only for Aryans in Vienna in 1939, just before she is leaving to the United States. And she is committing 3 offenses here. One is using this bench, which is she not supposed to. Then documenting this by taking a photograph. And later she actually smuggles the negative out to the United States, where it is now in the Holocaust Museum. So, and here, when we then start looking more and more of these photographs where Jews documented the persecution in a very disobedient way, like this one where Martin Marx photographed his family and the maid in front of this anti-Jewish slogan. And this is in 1935 in a small town in West Germany. So what I try to do in my research is not just kind of accumulating examples of disobedience, opposition, or kind of resistance. I try to rather conceptualize these individual acts of resistance in the context of anti-Jewish persecution. And this is only possible now after the last 3 decades revealed in a great detail the complexity and diversity of anti-Jewish persecution on all levels of the Nazi state, from the center to the region and then down to the local restrictions. And only because we now know about this diversity and often also these contradictory developments, it allows us much better to understand how and why and what Jews actually reacted and responded to. The second reason I see for the absence of individual resistance is that the traditional Holocaust narrative is based on, specifically for Germany, is based on a limited pool of sources. Almost exclusively, historians use Gestapo or SS reports to kind of figure out Jewish attitudes under the persecution. Also, more recently, diaries and memoirs of survivors would be used to document Jewish behavior. But in both of these sets of sources, individual Jewish resistance does not really appear. But in contrast, my study is based on hitherto unused sources, local material, and my journey actually started in the Berlin State Archives, where I kind of browsed through logbooks from police precincts. And these were covering the years 1933 till 1945, and they had been barely touched for research on the persecution of the Jews. And among thousands of handwritten reports by local policemen about lost keys, drunken people, stolen bicycles, naughty exhibitionists, suddenly there popped up evidence of public protest by individual Jews. And not just one, several arrests were documented there. So next I went to the special courts in Berlin and looked where these people tried there for political offenses. While I couldn't find any names from the police logbooks, I found many more examples of defined individual Jews which were tried in these special courts. Then the next step was to question, is this maybe just an outlier here because Berlin was this kind of center? It is often, you can read in Holocaust narratives that it was a refuge because of the anonymity there. So I conducted comparative microhistorical research on Hamburg, Munich, Leipzig, Frankfurt, Dresden, Vienna. And interestingly, in all of these local archives, more cases of public protest and other types of individual resistance appeared. To these local sources, I added a review of 170 interviews from the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. And while some of these testimonies confirmed the results from the archives, they also added amazing insights which I couldn't find in any archive. So let me present you with a kind of an overview how Jews responded to the persecution. Against the boycott of their shops and the loss of jobs, already in 1933, individual Jews, but also representatives of Jewish communities and organizations intervened first with written petitions. Such entreaties you can find in large numbers in almost any given German archive. Yet, as police records and video testimonies reveal, since 1933, Jews also openly criticized and protested Nazi persecution in public. Like in Frankfurt, already in March and April 1933, several Jews were prosecuted and sentenced by the state court for publicly criticizing the beatings and murders of Jews by stormtroopers, as well as the torture of Jews in early concentration camps. For example, on April 1st, the day of the notorious boycott, the state court in Frankfurt punished the merchant Erich Löwenstein, he was born in 1908, with a harsh sentence of 1 year for spreading rumors. Just a few days earlier, Löwenstein had spoken with some acquaintances, which happened to be members of the Nazi Party. He interrogated them if the Nazis wanted to drive the Jews out of Germany or harm the Jews in any way. Finally, he kind of insisted that there are these rumors and the news about Jews being killed in these early concentration camps. Yet, as police records and the USC Shoah Foundation interviews reveal, Jews did not stop with just verbal or oral critique. Jews also actively fought, for example, Nazi propaganda. Throughout the 1930s, Jews were arrested in Munich and Hamburg for besmearing displays of anti-Semitic newspapers, for contesting the Hitler salute, for destroying Nazi flags, posters, and symbols. And let me share one example with you. David Bernstein, who lived in Hamburg as a merchant, he stood at a bus stop in Hamburg in 1936 and tried to destroy the swastika logo on a local coach, on a local bus. He took his walking stick with both hands and scratched the swastika sign 3 times. He was denounced and arrested and Here you can see the sign. I don't know if you can, I try to magnify this. This is from the Gestapo records. I hope you can see these 3 scratches on the sign. Here you can see a Gestapo reenactment. This man in front who tries to show how the logo was scratched is a Gestapo officer. And inside the bus, it's the conductor of the bus who actually denounced Bernstein. David Bernstein was sentenced to 5 weeks in jail for the attempt to destroy the logo. Interestingly, this was not the end of the story. He fell later a victim to the raids against so-called asocials, where Jews with small criminal kind of offenses in their records were included and were brought to concentration camps. So Bernstein was incarcerated in a concentration camp in June 1938 and spent several months there. He fortunately survived. Many others with also similar small offenses for critique or protest actually died in concentration camps over the next months. Bernstein made it out to Palestine, though. Especially the anti-Jewish riots produced fierce reactions of the persecuted. For example, in Berlin, when stormtroopers and Hitler Youth attacked Jews and besmeared their stores in summer 1935, a business card-sized flyer was found in the mailbox of the biggest publishing house in Berlin. It contained the following message, and this is the police record about it. I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler." End of quote. During the months of July 1935 alone, the Berlin police arrested more than 100 Jews, most of them for offenses against the German state and the Nazi party. Quite remarkable was the fact that the Gestapo emphasized in her monthly report that Jews were born with disrespect for state authority. These summer riots in Berlin were followed by new local restrictions and, as you all know, the Nuremberg laws, which limited the individual freedom of German Jews even more. However, all over Germany, from Cologne to Königsberg, Jews ignored new city prohibitions, for example, to visit public swimming pools, cinemas, theaters, and operas. Others went to German courts demanding their rights, for example, when they were dismissed from jobs. And some spoke up in public, as Rosalie Kowalski in Frankfurt, born in 1887. She repeatedly cursed the Hitler Pack in public and told everybody who wanted to hear that Goebbels would just tell lies. She received 6 months in prison in 1937. She was sentenced under this law here, the law against treacherous attacks on the state and party. And this law was usually, we thought this was used against communists and social democrats. But it served the Nazi state since December 1934 also to punish critique and quell protest of Jews. Even more astonishing are unknown facts of Jewish physical self-defense against attacks, which emerged in numbers from the news sources. From the UC Shaw Foundation, we know that, or we learned that Jewish men got quite frequently into brawls with stormtroopers on the street or in their neighborhood, or with Nazi neighbors who were discriminating Jewish neighbors. For example, in Berlin, Frank Teilig, he beat up 2 SA men who terrorized an old Jewish lady in their apartment building which they shared. Teilig made it only out because of a sympathetic policeman out of Germany to Shanghai. Yet there was also physical resistance against authorities. And let me try to share a video clip with you. Oops. Sorry, I need to, oh yeah, okay.
The Germans have a perverse respect for courage or something. Der Stürmer, that was a German newspaper which I can remember, so was always displayed in glass display cases on public buildings, and I can remember so well looking at it. And they had these horrible caricatures of Jews, these little threatening men with these hooked noses. And in any case, Der Stürmer had when my Uncle Fritz's father died, who had also been a lawyer, there was a front page story in the Stürmer. His name was Joseph Thal, that when Dr. Joseph Thal died and the authorities went into his home, in his basement they found the bodies of Jewish virgins and children. And he had probably used their blood in Passover rituals. That was the story on the Stürmer. My Uncle Fritz, his son, had been an officer in the German during World War I, and as a matter of fact had won the Iron Cross, which is, I don't know, it's the highest, but a very high decoration. And when he read that story in the Stürmer, he put on his World War I uniform, his riding boots, his riding crop, put his medal on his chest, and went down to the Stürmer's office. And Julius Streicher was the editor. And he marched up there in his uniform and up to the receptionist and said, "I want to see, Herr Streicher." And the receptionist said, "I'm sorry, you have no appointment." And my uncle just sort of pushed him aside and walked in there and walked up to Streicher's desk. And Streicher looked up surprised, to see this uniformed German officer. And Uncle Fritz said, "Did you know Herr Dr. Joseph Thal?" And Streicher said no, and my uncle took his whip and said, "Then meet his son," and beat him a couple of times, turned around fully expecting to be arrested, to be shot, to be something, walked out. Nothing ever happened to him.
And just to kind of make clear that this is not just a family story, there's another interview actually from the same town, Nuremberg, which corroborates this event, this incident. But also to make clear, not every German Jew was so courageous. That's also we have to really have in mind. So, for example, Paul Malch, a leather product merchant from Düsseldorf, wrote hundreds of family letters from Germany to his son in the United States. Out of fear of censorship, not a single line critiques the Nazi state or the persecution. Not a single line in hundreds of these letters. However, still he fearing the censorship, he used the opportunity when he made 2 business trips in 1937 to the Netherlands to put on fierce anti-Nazi complaints on the letterhead of his hotel, which he then sent to his son in the United States. This example illuminates that the reason why a lot of these letters we know from German Jews are so apolitical in their tone and don't really talk much about the persecution. Talking about the devastating German-wide pogrom of November 1938, there's also documentation that Jews responded in a variety of ways. Some saved religious objects from burning synagogues, others secured goods from devastated stores and apartments, and some took pictures or wrote down lists of addresses of destroyed shops, which were denounced and arrested by the Berlin police, for example. And just recently, we came across photographs which were done by German Jews documenting the destruction of their homes when they were attacked during the Kristallnacht. Here you see pictures taken by Hans Sachs in Nuremberg, documenting the vandalism of the stormtroopers in his private apartment. And some Jews also critiqued the violent events either during the attacks or during the days following the pogrom. For example, Henriette Schäfer, born in 1882, entered a shop in Frankfurt the next day and asked the owner, quote, "What are you saying about the fact that everything is being destroyed and the synagogues are arsoned?" End of quote. After the neighbor came up with the official narrative that the people are outraged about the murder of a German diplomat by a Jew, Schäfer replied, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. She received 6 months in prison for this comment. And some even dared to physically resist their attackers. When in Peine, a small town in Lower Saxony, a group of SS-men invaded the Marburger family apartment and started to beat up the father of the family, Hans, a 17-year-old boy, tried to fend them off. Unfortunately, the 3 SS-men overwhelmed him, dragged him out of the house, and locked him up in the synagogues, which they then set ablaze with gasoline. Another case is of Diane Jacobs. Back then, her name was Daisy Gronowski. She was 16 years old, lived in a Hachshara training camp where she prepared for her immigration to Palestine. This camp, as many, came under attack during the pogrom. And let me share her story with you.
You know, the youngsters and the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden I came my turn and I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5 foot nothing. I'm 5'1". 5 foot nothing. And I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back. And that was it. I just walked through very slowly looking at all of them. Now here, big tough guys. You want to hit a little girl. What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back, it hurt. And I got to the end of the line, one of them grabs me, grabs this hand, my right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I had learned a little trick, and that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him, and I started fighting, and I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand. I used the knife, I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his stomach. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy beating up on him. So a couple of the guys saw it and they dragged him underneath a bed or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so that the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off.
Just to clarify, the trick she used was a jiu-jitsu trick she had learned in her Hashomer HaTzair group in Berlin, back in Berlin, where they trained Jewish youth in self-defense. She is a remarkable woman who later escaped several times arrest and made it safely out to Great Britain in 1939, and then later ended up in Los Angeles. After the pogrom, as you know, there was a new kind of set of local restrictions and national restrictions. And the archives in Frankfurt, Hamburg, Vienna, or Leipzig are filled with dozens of files showing that Jews disobeyed these new national rules. For example, to hand over their precious metals, to wear special identification cards, or to, and this is was the most surprising to me, to adopt the discriminatory middle names Israel and Sarah. I never thought about that. I thought always they were forced to adopt them. But in Germany, there is a law about names, and you have kind of to request name changes. That means every Jew had to fill out a form and pay 3 Reichsmark to request the adoption of these discriminatory middle names. And the archives showed dozens of files where Jews just refused to do this. For example, in Berlin, the 68-year-old painter Max Antlers declined the repeated request to fill out the form, even after he had to report to the police station. In Leipzig, the 73-year-old Ida Schneider didn't apply for the ID card and also refused to adopt the name Sarah. She was only discovered in 1941 and then received a 7-month prison sentence for her offenses. Jews also still spoke up against national and local measures. For example, in Vienna's housing office, Dr. Arthur Singer loudly cursed Hitler after having been expelled from his municipal apartment in summer 1939. Singer even urged his fellow Jewish fellows who waited with him at the housing office to join his protest and against these city orders and storm the offices. Such individual acts of protest did not even stop in wartime. In Berlin, the former tailor Alfred Levitan had already been sentenced to jail time for public comments against the German state. In jail, he smuggled letters out of into the mail order catalogs, which were printed in prison, calling for an uprising and blaming Germany's war on Hitler's mistake to persecute the Jews. Local restrictions were disregarded too. For example, in Berlin, the police introduced limited shopping hours for Jews, and Hedwig Hornung So Hedwig Hornung went to a shop, and when the shop owner declined her request to sell her bread because she was visiting at another different time from the limited shopping hours, she snapped and exclaimed, quote, "The new decree is too much. Soon we won't get ration cards anymore either, and we will die a wretched death," end of quote. Some even defied multiple local restrictions. For example, Max Mannheimer, who performed forced labor at the road construction site in Bohemia, wrote in his diary, and this is one of the very few quotes I found about this type of resistance in diaries, quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind the tool shed. From there I go to the public park despite the 8 p.m. curfew and despite the ban to visit the park. On my way, I count the signs with the slogan, 'Forbidden for Jews.' In total, there are 6. Later, at 11 p.m., I rip the signs out of the ground and throw some of them in the bushes, some in the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all the signs had reemerged. For a second time, I didn't have the courage. I'm just not a hero," end of quote. This is interesting in 2 regards. First, he didn't speak about this in his interview for the Shoah Foundation in 1996. But secondly, since he went back the next evening, he again committed several offenses against local restrictions. So his personal kind of characteristic that he is not a hero is kind of highly disputable. While Nazis penalized public protest and even private critique under the treacherous attacks law, other acts of defiance were penalized under different rules. For example, Jews deliberately ignored to hand over radios, then they were punished under the law against radio crimes. Laura Rechnitz in Vienna was sent to jail using the German penal code after she had broken the curfew. Breaking the curfew was very common to visit bars, restaurants, cinemas, and theaters, or for other purposes, as you saw with the example of Max Mannheimer, or at the beginning of my talk with Hans Oppenheimer with the wrong fire alarms. Interestingly, Jews were also tried for treason. In Munich, the former real estate broker Benno Neuberger, a man in his 60s, he kind of reacted to the order to brand the Jews with the yellow star in 1941. This was the last straw for him. Despite the Hitler's attacks since 1933, Benno Neuberger still had perceived himself as a proud German from Munich. Now, after the yellow star was introduced, he felt different, ostracized, humiliated, and utterly unprotected. Yet he did not give in. He, between September 1941 and February 1942, Benno Neuberger applied these kind of Hitler post stamps to dozens of postcards and wrote abusive comments on them. For example, the first postcard read, I quote, "The eternal mass murderer Hitler, disgusting, exclamation mark," quote end. Another postcard bore the four-sided comment, Hitler, murderer of 5 million, end of quote. He was arrested and put on trial for treason, but still there, in front of the People's Court in Berlin, he argued openly that he hated Hitler, especially for the pronouncement of January 1939, when Hitler announced that he will exterminate all Jews when there will be a new world war. He was sentenced with the death penalty and decapitated in September 1942. Many other acts of resistance were performed during the war, for example, resisting forced labor, sabotage, escape from camps, arrests, but also from deportations. And you all have heard stories about hiding. In total, 10 to 12,000 Jews went into hiding in Nazi Germany, which is quite a remarkable number because they defied the deportation orders. And at the end of February 1943, during the so-called factory raid in Berlin, more than 4,000 Jews went into hiding within a few days. 4,000. This was the biggest mass resistance act performed by German Jews against Nazi policies. And this was not organized at all. This was all individual acts of resistance, uncoordinated, unorganized. And some even kind of prepared to resist with arms when they went into hiding. Oh, I forgot to show you this picture from Benno Neuberger. In a police logbook, I found this event where in August 1943, Kurt Jacobsen was shot at the street in Berlin. The police had discovered by accident that in a hidden apartment where he lived, he had live ammunition, guns, and also forged identification papers. So what I kind of tried to show in this rough survey, and there are so many more cases, so this is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of these acts are forgotten today because even the smallest act of defiance or critique resulted in harsh punishment by Nazi courts. Mostly Jews were kind of punished with jail sentences. Some ended up in concentration camps. Many of these Jews perished, but still some, as I showed, could emigrate. However, after the liberation, there was almost no talk about these kinds of resistance because Jews had other kind of things to worry about. The details about the mass extermination surfaced. There was just kind of people seeking survival. So no real discussion about these kinds of acts emerged after the war. So let me conclude. 3 weeks after Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the 30-year-old Edith Britz wrote a letter that was intercepted. Earlier, she had already been denunciated for race defilement and political conversations with non-Jewish Germans. She only got away without a sentence because witnesses had vouched for her, and that's how she got away without a sentence. In this letter, the Jewish woman from Berlin described that one morning at 6 a.m., 2 police officers knocked on her door. In that moment, she felt like she would do anything to prevent them from arresting her. And I quote, "I'm so upset that I could attack anybody who wants to come into my pad. I will go crazy. If there will be more, they stole my sleep. They stole everything from me." End of quote. This quotation reveals the level of anxiety and anger and repulsion that many Jews seem to feel after experiencing years of anti-Jewish policies and personal humiliation and discrimination. I think it's not too far-fetched to assume that such emotions might have triggered many of the individual actions of Jewish women and men. Defining resistance as any kind of individual or group action against Nazi laws and Nazi policies changes our perspective. Now we can understand for the first time more correctly what the trope of the impudent Jews, which we find in a lot of Gestapo and SS reports, actually referred to. It meant actual opposition and protest by individual Jews. Most historians, including myself, kind of took these kind of tropes as fabricated pretexts to introduce harsher measures. But in reality, every Jewish man and woman had to develop particular and over time changing strategies in response to persecution. First, against Nazi propaganda and anti-economic measures, next against violent attacks and local restrictions, later against segregationist laws and decrees, and then finally against forced labor and deportation. I kind of systematized 5 prominent types of individual Jewish resistance in my research. One is contesting Nazi propaganda. Second, oral protest and critique. The third is written protest, which includes petitions, but also leaflets, anonymous postcards, and so on. The fourth is defying anti-Jewish laws and restrictions, from national laws to local measures. And the last one is physical self-defense. Some might question if such acts can be counted as resistance. But I think it is not up to us, the scholars or the public, and not even up to the victims to define what is resistance. My research shows that the smallest acts of Jewish defiance triggered ruthless Nazi persecution. Even some critical words could be enough to end up in jail or in a concentration camp. So in the end, for me, it only matters what the Nazis thought about as resistance. As my research indicates, individual resistance was neither an exception, probably it was also not the rule, but it was much more widespread than we ever thought. It existed in all strands of the Jewish population, regardless of gender, age, belief, or social status. And many cases still are unknown, since not every case left actually traces in the archives. Because of the persecuted performed so many acts of opposition, the image of the passive victim needs to be thrown out forever. For us, it's now up to integrate these stories and these courageous acts into the general narrative of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. And this is not only too important to preserve their memory, but also to understand them as really deliberate individual reactions to diverse, changing local, regional, and central Nazi measures. As the Berlin rabbi Max Nussbaum recalled, I quote, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 of different manners," end of quote. And I think this research in a way helps to give finally agency back to the German youth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Grinners, for such a stimulating and wide-ranging talk. I've really learned a lot. It's really fascinating. And just to say to the audience that if you have any questions, then put them in the chat, and then I'll have a look at them and get to as many as I can. So just to kick us off, I wanted to say, I mean, I think that when you kind of look at armed resistance, you're often talking about quite young people involved. And I suppose by focusing on these individual acts, it seems to me from what you've said and the examples that you gave, that actually you see resistance from across all age groups, and it kind of changes our understanding of who resistors were, therefore.
Yeah, so this was for me really remarkable, that there are no patterns. The only patterns are actually two, which I identified. in all of the cases I found. There's one thing where kind of the older notion that more younger Jews are more inclined to resist is more true for the physical self-defense. That's kind of, I think I can say. However, I'm always kind of, in a way, hesitant to make big claims here because there's so much not discovered yet, so which might change this picture. And the other pattern I've discovered was that elderly Jews were more inclined to refuse the name change, the adoption of the of Sarah and Israel. And this is was interesting for me. It shows a lot about their passion about being Germans or German Jews, because this was part of their kind of life identity, that they didn't want to change these names, which is also true for younger Jews, but not in the kind of amount in the files I saw. There is kind of a tendency more elderly Jews.
Yes,
but otherwise, I have really remarkably kind of all facets are kind of from all age sets.
Yes, yes. So we've got a question from Joe who asks whether there are examples of resistance or protests that succeeded in making the Nazis make any changes to their policies.
Yes. So, for example, there are changes in the resistance against forced labor. There are modifications with the deportations. So you can actually say there are the Nazis kind of really looked at what the Jews did and then modified certain policies. Not all, but some of them. So there was an impact.
Yes. And Emily, who is a teacher, says her students often ask her whether German Jews refuse to wear the yellow star.
Yeah, so this is a good question because this is actually what you can find, one of the few things you can find also in memoirs and also in the interviews, where Jews mention that they either didn't really put kind of a sword onto their clothing, the star, that they used clips so that they could remove it, or that they covered it with their arms or kind of bags or something. And interesting is really here, I didn't mention this because that's also a story in itself, but I found an interesting example in a small town in the Protectorate in October 1948, 1 month after the star was introduced. The Gestapo goes to the Jewish community and complains about dozens of Jews who resist to wear the star. And they say they have to face harsh consequences. We will arrest them, so make sure that they wear the star. 1 month later, the same Gestapo officer talks to the same representative of the Jewish community and says, I arrested dozens of Jews. What happened here? Still there are Jews not wearing the star in your town. 2 months later, the same conversation happened. And then finally, the last conversation about the same kind of topic occurred in, I think, May 1942, where still Jews refused to wear the star and were arrested for it in the same small town.
Yes. So yes, we can see quite persistent refusal.
Yeah, and you find this everywhere. I mean, this was really one of the more widespread attitudes, actually, to not wear the star.
Yes. So Amanda's asking whether the kind of nature of this individual Jewish resistance changed once the war broke out.
Yeah, so this was interesting for me. I tried to kind of hint to this in my conclusion. There is, as policies change, also the type and the form of these individual acts also change. So in the beginning, it's more against this propaganda and everything. During the war, it is often more openly critique against the persecution, but it's also against the specific measures which were kind of more enforced during the war, like forced labor or the deportations. So clearly, the type of resistance changed according to the policies which are kind of affecting the Jewish population.
Yes. And then,
but I want to say, sorry, maybe the kind of goal of the question was actually to figure out, was there less resistance in the war than before? And I have to say, I don't see this. I have so many kind of trials and cases which are 1939, 1940, 1941. So I don't really see that there is a big decline there. The only thing what I see is actually when you look at all the years from 33 till 45, you see certain spikes, and the spikes of opposition and protest, they are kind of connected to either certain laws which are enacted, certain anti-Jewish measures, or anti-Jewish violence, like pogrom, for example, and so on.
Yes. So Jelly is conducting research into her grandfather's experiences. He was imprisoned and is wondering where she might locate things like police logbooks and court reports, which archives to go to.
Yeah, so I made the logbooks very prominent because they kind of triggered my research, but they are unfortunately only available in Berlin. That's the only place where they survived the war. So I didn't find any other city or town where you have these comparable logbooks. There might be still out there because I'm limited in my capabilities. So I couldn't really go to all the local archives in Germany. There are many. But I would say the best way to do it depends on the region. Some of the German archives are extremely well organized, so you can actually ask a kind of request for names and they search, and you can find like trial records. Especially the special court records or court records in general are often well preserved. Not that they are kind of entirely available. It's, for example, in Berlin, only 1/3 of the court cases survived, but still 1/3 of 10,000 cases. It's a lot, right? And similar is in other cities where, so court cases, there are plenty, I would say. And then in some cases, for example, with Hans Oppenheimer, the 17-year-old boy, I was able to find his prison records. So there are in many archives also records of the jails and prisons, where you can also find, even if you don't have a trial, you can find the judgment and the indictment in these prison records. So there is a lot to find still.
Yes. So I've now got a question from Tim Robertson of the Anne Frank Trust UK. And he asks, to what extent this Jewish resistance to the Nazis can be seen as part of a wider global tradition of civil disobedience or peaceful resistance?
Yeah, that's a wonderful kind of a thought. And I think this is actually what triggered my whole understanding of individual resistance, because I grew up in East Germany under a dictatorship. So my understanding how people react to a dictatorship was all informed by my own personal experience. And so it is true, there is, especially in dictatorships, there is always this civil disobedience, there is always resistance. And what sometimes we don't really can convey in democratic societies, the repercussions for speaking out are fundamentally different in a dictatorship than in a democratic society. And this is what I think is also so important when we think about resistance. This speaking up in a dictatorship has the harshest of consequences. And so it is prominent. And I think my research and the framework is applicable, first of all, to other occupied territories during the Holocaust for Jews. But also in my studies, I found a lot of non-Jewish Germans who also protested, not just against the Nazi state, but even against the persecution of the Jews. So there's also interesting stuff coming out. And then beyond this, I think in any kind of dictatorship, there are similar kind of reactions and responses to find.
Yes, thank you. Just a couple more questions. Ellie is asking whether you would consider suicide by Jews as a form of resistance, or and it might be, she's mentioning that letters might be left behind, or people might wear medals, World War I medals and so on.
Yeah, so that's also a very good point. So in my book, actually, in my manuscript, I have a part in the introduction where I talk about this discussion, because there is some hesitancy to really think about suicide, but also escape, for example, or as kind of a method of resistance. But she already alluded to the main kind of proving point. There are quite a few attempts of successful suicides where we have documents like letters where they talk why they did this, and where they kind of complain about the kind of critique the resistance, the persecution. So there is clearly the connection between the act and the motivation. There are other cases where they took their life on the Jewish cemetery in front of the grave of a Jewish war hero. And so there are a lot of kind of symbolic acts actually regarding suicides. And I think in a way, as I said, my definition is very broad. So anything which kind of interferes with Nazi plans, I would kind of describe as resistance.
Yes. And then Anka is asking whether you consider schooling in Jewish private schools during times of persecution as a form of resistance, so maintaining education.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually one of the more well accepted kind of parts of when we think about spiritual and cultural resistance. This was brought up by kind of Israeli scholars already right after the war, that education, preserving of your religion is part of the resistance against the Nazis. So I totally agree in this regard, that this was in a way educating, also providing access to different information. We should not kind of underestimate how more and more restricted information access was for Jews in Nazi Germany. And to kind of counter this information restriction by education in schools was very important. And in the same way, we have also increasingly adult education throughout the 30s and in Nazi Germany, which is kind of also serves this goal, not just preparation for immigration.
Yes.
So, and then just one last thought.
Yes.
There are also, for example, very important lecture series given by Berlin rabbis, for example. And one of the most dearest to my heart is the Berlin rabbi Joachim, who was kind of expelled from Germany by the Gestapo in 1937 because he actually used sermons, but also public lectures in adult education to criticize the Nazis. And so he talked openly about that the Jews in Germany lived in the ghetto in 1935.
Yes. And then just finally, because we're sort of running out of time, I think there's a lot of interest from the audience in when your book will be published, and somebody's also asked what your likely title is. So I don't know if you can give us any information about when all of this will be published.
So yeah, I'm not sure, because I'm right now I'm looking, or I'm searching for an agent, since this is will be a not an academic book, so I can't go to an academic publisher. Everybody told me I need an agent, so I'm kind of in the process of trying to find this. I got some rejections, interestingly, and so this is a little bit unknown. My working title right now is Impudent Jews: Forgotten Acts of Individual Resistance in Hitler's Germany. So that's my working title.
Great. Well, I hope that when it's published, we can welcome you back to launch it, possibly in person. We'll see. But we'd be very keen to have a book launch, I think. So yeah, just finally to say, we've had very positive reaction in the chat from the audience. So thank you so much for a fascinating lecture and giving us your insights. And we look forward to the book. And thank you everybody for attending and such interesting questions, and we hope to see you again at future Wiener Holocaust Library events. So thanks everyone, and good night.
Thanks for having me.